It was late, the kind of night where the road seems to stretch on forever, a ribbon of asphalt under the cold glow of truck stop lights. I was hauling a load of goods from Texas to New Mexico, heading west on Interstate 40, the long road stretching before me like an unbroken line. It had been a quiet shift, no traffic, no distractions, just me, my truck, and the constant hum of the engine. I'm no rookie behind the wheel. I've been driving trucks for years, and in all that time, I thought I had seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare I was about to endure. It started just outside of Amarillo, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. The headlights of my rig cut through the darkness, barely illuminating the wide stretch of road ahead. I had been listening to some old rock tunes on the radio, keeping myself awake. My eyelids were getting heavy, and I was on the verge of pulling over at a rest stop to grab a quick nap when something caught my attention. Off in the distance, a flickering light. At first, I thought it was just another trucker, maybe a police car or someone's headlights playing tricks in the haze. But as I got closer, I saw that it was something different. The light wasn't moving, not like a vehicle would. It stayed in place, a soft, steady glow hovering in the air. I slowed down, my hands tightening on the wheel, unsure of what I was seeing. Then, out of nowhere, the radio cut out, going silent. My truck's interior lights flickered, and for a moment, everything seemed to be still. Too still. I pulled over to the shoulder, my instincts telling me something was off. My heart raced in my chest, but I tried to calm myself. I had been on the road too long, I thought, maybe just tired, hallucinating from the exhaustion. But that light, it didn't sit right with me. Something deep down told me to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight from the passenger seat and climbed down from the cab. The cold night air hit me, the kind of chill that cuts right through you. I stepped cautiously toward the flickering light, keeping my eyes locked on it. I couldn't explain it, but the closer I got, the more my nerves were on edge. I swear I could hear faint whispers on the wind, something just outside of hearing range. I was about 20 feet away from the light when I froze. A figure stood in the glow. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe a stranded motorist, but something was off. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall. Its silhouette was shadowy, its features blurred. There was no clear definition, no sense of life or humanity in it. I was paralyzed, staring at it, but it wasn't moving. It was just standing there. A shiver ran down my spine, and before I could react, a sudden flash of light blinded me. It was like a camera flash, bright and quick, and when it faded, the figure was gone. But it left behind a suffocating silence, a weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. I rushed back to my truck, heart pounding in my chest. I don't know why, but the idea of getting back in that cab and driving away felt safer than standing out there any longer. I didn't look back until I was safely inside, and I slammed the door shut. I tried to start the engine, but the truck sputtered and stalled. Panic set in. I turned the key again. Nothing. The truck was dead, not a sound, no lights, no hum of the engine. I grabbed my phone, praying for a signal, but of course, there was nothing. Just dead air. I was stranded. It felt like hours, but I couldn't just sit there waiting. The longer I did, the more uneasy I felt. I decided to walk back to the rest area. Maybe I'd find someone who could help, a trucker or a cop. Someone with some sense of what was going on. But as I made my way down the road, something changed. The night was quiet, too quiet. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness. It wasn't a normal kind of silence. It was the kind that wraps around you, suffocates you. I finally saw a pair of headlights approaching. Relief washed over me as the familiar sight of a police car came into view. The officer pulled over next to me, and I made my way toward him, my hope rising. The officer stepped out of the car. He was tall, solid build, wearing a dark uniform. He looked about my age, but his face was hard, grim. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to hide the shakiness in my voice. He glanced over at my truck, then at me. His eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't be out here, son," he said, his voice low, almost warning. "What are you doing?" My truck just stalled. I was hoping you could help me. There's something strange going on out here. I saw something weird." I was rambling, but I didn't care. I needed to make sense of this to know that I wasn't going crazy. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step back, scanning the road. "You're not the first one tonight," he said finally. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? You wouldn't believe me if I told you, he said, his voice almost too soft. He glanced around again before leaning in closer, lowering his voice. We've had reports of strange things out here for years. People disappearing, only to reappear days later, not remembering a thing. Sometimes they see things, like that light. It's been happening for decades. People who think they're just tired or hallucinating, but it's something more, something not human. My blood ran cold. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. But before I could ask more, the officer held up a hand. Get in the car. It's not safe here. Without another word, I got in the back of the squad car. The officer didn't start driving right away. Instead, he just sat there, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. We didn't talk. The air between us was thick, filled with unspoken fear. And then, just as we pulled away, I saw it again, the flickering light. But this time, it wasn't just one. There were dozens scattered across the horizon, as if the entire world had been overtaken by some unseen force. The officer's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Don't look at it. Don't look at the lights. But it was too late. I couldn't look away. I watched as the lights began to pulse, growing brighter and more erratic, like fireflies caught in a storm. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, my vision blurring. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came to, I was back in my truck. The engine was running again, the lights were on, and I was alone. I tried to call the officer, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had never existed. My phone was still dead, and I had no way of explaining what had happened. I just knew one thing for sure. I had seen something that night, and whatever it was far from human. I drove the rest of the way to New Mexico in silence, not daring to stop, not even for gas. I never spoke about that night to anyone, and I doubt I ever will. But one thing is certain, some things are better left unexplained.
Next story.
I'll never forget the night that changed my life. The long stretches of road, the loneliness that follows a trucker's every turn, and the strange feelings that creep into the mind when you're alone in the dark. These are the things that make the trucking world something of a mystery. But that night was no ordinary run. It was late, way past midnight. I was driving through a remote part of Ohio, making my way to a delivery stop in a small town I'd never been to before. I had been on the road for hours and was starting to feel the exhaustion creep in, but it wasn't the kind of tiredness that would make me stop. It was that kind of tiredness that just makes you crave a little company, just someone to talk to for a few minutes to take your mind off the endless miles ahead. I could see the headlights of my truck cutting through the darkness, and the eerie silence of the highway was interrupted only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of wind against the trees. It's the kind of silence that sets your mind spinning, like you're being watched even though you're all alone. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights coming up behind me, but nothing ever appeared. Then, as I passed a stretch of woods, I saw it. At first, I thought it was a deer, but the shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin. It was standing in the shadows at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat. It looked like a person, but it wasn't moving, just standing there like it was waiting for something. I slowed down instinctively, though there was no logical reason to. Maybe I was just hoping it would disappear if I didn't look at it too long. I pulled my eyes away from the rearview and tried to focus on the road ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That thing, whatever it was, had been watching me. Not wanting to take any chances, I reached for my CB radio. "Breaker, breaker," I called out. "Anyone on this channel?" There was a moment of silence, then a gruff voice crackled through the speaker. "Yeah. What's up, driver?" "Hey, I'm heading down Route 82 and just passed some weird figure by the woods. You guys seeing anything strange around here?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my nerves were starting to get the better of me. The voice on the other end paused before answering. "You talking about the guy who stands by the road?" My stomach dropped. "What? Who?" "That's the Watcher, man. People say he appears sometimes, just standing in the dark. No one knows who he is or why he does it. Some folks swear he's a ghost. Other guys say he's just a guy with a messed up mind. Either way, he freaks people out." My hands were sweating now, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear any more. "You're saying he's not real?" I asked, trying to hold it together. Real? I don't know, but if you're smart, you won't stop. You just keep driving. I didn't need to hear any more. My foot hit the accelerator harder than I meant to, and the truck roared down the highway, eager to put distance between me and whatever that thing was. I didn't even look back, but my mind kept racing, replaying the image of that tall, unnatural figure standing in the trees. But as I sped down the road, I noticed something I hadn't heard in a while. A siren. The flashing lights appeared in my rearview mirror, cutting through the dark like a blade. A cop car was behind me, its lights flashing in the distance, growing closer by the second. I groaned. It figures. Just what I needed. Another hassle on an already stressful night. I pulled over to the shoulder of the highway and waited. The cop car came to a slow stop behind me, and a tall officer stepped out. He was in full uniform, but there was something about his gait that made me uneasy. He didn't walk like a normal cop. His steps were too slow, too deliberate. He approached my window and I rolled it down. "Evening, officer," I said, trying to sound as friendly as I could, despite the growing sense of dread gnawing at my insides. The officer looked at me for a long time without speaking, his eyes scanning me as if he were looking for something. His face was stone cold, and there was no warmth in his voice when he finally spoke. "You see anything strange out here tonight, driver?" I froze. "What do you mean?" "Out on the road. Something. Not right," he said cryptically, as though he expected me to know exactly what he meant. I felt a cold shiver run up my spine. I saw something by the woods back there. It looked like a person, but... He nodded slowly, like he had heard this before. "You saw the Watcher, didn't you?" "Yeah," I admitted, barely able to form the words. "But what's he supposed to be?" The officer's face darkened, and for the first time I noticed his hands were shaking. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not something you want to mess with." I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "But you're a cop. What are you doing out here?" The officer shifted his gaze over his shoulder as if checking the road. "I patrol these roads at night. We all do. Some of us never make it back." The air around us seemed to grow colder as he spoke, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right about this whole situation. The officer was acting strange, his words heavy with an unspoken warning. "Listen," the officer continued, "you need to keep moving. Don't stop for anything. If you see that thing again, just keep driving. And if you hear any sirens, don't look back. It's not real." Before I could respond, he turned and walked back to his patrol car, but not in the usual way. He moved slowly, and with each step his figure seemed to blur and fade as if he were dissolving into the night. By the time he reached his car, he was nothing more than a silhouette in the darkness. The siren wailed once, and then it was gone. I didn't wait around to figure out what had just happened. My foot slammed the accelerator down, and I sped off into the night, the road stretching ahead like a black ribbon that seemed endless. I didn't see anything else for the rest of the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I could almost hear the sound of footsteps behind me, even though no one was there. My rear view mirror was a constant source of paranoia. Every time I glanced at it, I expected to see the flashing lights of a patrol car or that tall figure standing by the roadside, waiting. When I finally reached my delivery point, I was exhausted and shaken, but relieved to be done with the run. I didn't even care about unloading the truck. I just wanted to get inside, lock the door, and forget the horrors of the night. But the thing is, I never could forget it. Even now, years later, I can still feel the chill in the air when I think about that night. I don't know who that officer was or if he was even real, but I know this. There's something out there on those long, lonely stretches of highway, and it's watching. Always watching.
Next story.
It was supposed to be an easy run. I've been a trucker for almost 10 years now, so nothing really scares me anymore. I've seen my fair share of weird things on the road, strange hitchhikers, bizarre accidents, things that didn't add up, but nothing like this. This one time, this one night, changed everything. It was late October, and I was on a solo run down a stretch of Route 66. The night was dark, and the air was thick with fog, the kind that makes your headlights seem like they're cutting through a wall of smoke. The truck roared steadily beneath me, the tires humming on the asphalt, and all I could hear was the low growl of the engine. I had my radio on, but it was quiet, barely a whisper of static. I'd driven this stretch hundreds of times, and usually it's quiet. Empty roads, the occasional diner or gas station, but tonight it felt different. The silence was oppressive, like the world had gone dead. I wasn't the only one out there, though. I saw the occasional car whiz by, lights briefly blurring in the distance, but they were few and far between. It was the kind of silence that feels wrong, like something's just waiting, lurking. I passed a small town around midnight. It was just a dot on the map, nothing special, but I had a feeling like I should stop. Something about it called to me, like a whisper in the wind. But I pushed on. I had a schedule to keep. Somewhere just outside of town, I saw a police car. Its lights weren't flashing, but it was parked on the shoulder, the officer standing beside it. At first, I thought nothing of it, maybe just a routine stop, but as I got closer, something felt off. The officer's posture was strange. He was standing there like he was waiting for something. No car, no flashing lights, nothing. Just standing in the middle of nowhere, staring at me as I passed by. I felt an odd shiver crawl down my spine, but I kept driving. It was probably just a late-night cop who'd seen a wild animal or something. Nothing to get worked up over. A few miles down the road, I saw more headlights coming from behind me. I checked my rearview mirror and saw the same police car, only this time, it was much closer. Too close. In the dark, the blue and red lights flickered on for a second, then went out again. The car was tailing me now, close enough that I could make out the faint outline of the officer behind the wheel. Now, I've been driving long enough to know that if a cop is following you, it's probably for a reason. But I hadn't been speeding. I hadn't even passed any signs warning of speed limits or checkpoints. Still, I slowed down, thinking the officer would pull me over. The car stayed right behind me, though, barely giving me any space. My mind raced. Maybe I'd missed something. Maybe I was being paranoid, but something wasn't right. My gut twisted with unease. I had an eerie sense that I wasn't supposed to be here. This road, this place, it felt cursed, like it was waiting for something. Suddenly, the police car's lights flared up again, just for a split second, but it was enough. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, expecting to see the flashing lights, but there was nothing. No car, no officer, just empty road. I slammed on the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt on the road, my heart racing. I threw open the door, stepping out into the chilly night, the only sound now the distant hum of the highway. I scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of the cop car, but nothing. There was no police car, no officer, just the fog and the dead silence. I stood there for a long moment, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. My breath was fogging in the cold air, and I was shaking. The fear hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just a car that had followed me. It was something else, something that didn't belong. I got back in the truck and drove off, not daring to look behind me. I wanted to forget the whole thing, but it wouldn't leave me alone. I was looking at the road, but my mind kept drifting back to that officer. The way he had stood there in the middle of nowhere, just staring at me. The way the lights had flickered, then disappeared. By the time I reached the next town, I'd convinced myself that it was just a trick of the mind. Maybe it had been another driver with a car that looked like a cop's. But deep down, I knew better. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like I'd brushed up against the edge of something I wasn't supposed to see. At the next truck stop, I pulled in to fuel up and take a break. I was tired, my eyes heavy, but I couldn't relax. I went inside, grabbed a coffee, and tried to shake the feeling. The truck stop was quiet, too. The lights flickered overhead, and the place smelled like stale coffee and engine grease. I sat down at the counter, the mug warm in my hands, trying to calm my nerves. The woman behind the counter looked up at me, her expression stiff. "You seen a cop on the road tonight?" she asked, her voice low. I blinked, surprised by the question. "Yeah, a few miles back. Why?" She leaned in closer, her eyes darting around like she didn't want anyone to hear. "You know, there's a story about this stretch of highway. They say the cops that patrol it aren't real." I frowned. "What do you mean? Like ghost cops?" Her voice dropped even lower, more like lost souls. "Some say the officers who've patrolled this road never left. They've died in accidents or on duty, and now they just roam waiting for someone to cross their path. They won't show up on the radio, and they don't appear in the system. Just there, watching." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. You're telling me I saw one of them? She nodded. It's a warning. You don't want to go out there after dark anymore. The air in the truck stop suddenly felt colder, and I couldn't get the image of that officer out of my head, the way he'd stood there, waiting, watching. I finished my coffee in a hurry, paid, and left. The fog was thicker now, and the road ahead seemed darker, more oppressive. I was tired, and my mind was racing. It was hard to shake off the idea of the ghost cop, or whatever it was that had been following me. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see the officer's face staring back at me, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of highway. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that officer, his silhouette in the fog, waiting for me to drive past. The next morning, I was still shaken. I reached out to a buddy of mine who worked as a cop, asked him if he'd ever heard anything like this. He laughed it off, but there was something in his voice that made me feel like he knew more than he was letting on. Just don't go driving that stretch at night, he said. There's always been something strange about it. I never went back. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that there are things out there on those empty roads. Things that aren't supposed to be there. You might not see them, but sometimes they see you. And if you're not careful, they might just follow you home.
Next story.
It was late autumn when I had the run that's haunted me ever since. A quiet stretch of highway between Memphis and Little Rock, a place known for its isolation and its sense of endlessness. I was on a solo drive as usual, the truck's engine humming and the wheels eating up the miles with steady precision. At that hour, it was just me and the road. I've done countless midnight hauls, so I was used to the solitude, but this night, something felt wrong from the moment I hit the road. I'd been on Route 64 for hours when the first sign of trouble appeared. The sky above had been a dull gray, the sun long gone, leaving nothing but a heavy blanket of clouds. Around 2 a.m., as I passed through a remote area near a small town called Abbott, I noticed something strange. There was a faded sign that had clearly been there for years, warning of a low bridge. But here's the thing. I had passed that sign many times before, and it had never bothered me. This time, however, it felt different. I don't know how to explain it. It was almost as if the sign was glowing, calling to me. As I approached it, I saw something else, a figure standing on the side of the road, hidden in the shadows. It was hard to make out at first, but as I got closer, I could see the faint outline of a person. Not a hitchhiker, though. There was something unnatural about the way they stood, their shoulders stiff and their posture rigid. I slowed down instinctively. I could barely see their face, but the outline of their head was unnervingly still. I was about to keep going when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my stomach lurch, a flashing light. At first, I thought it was another truck coming from behind, but there was no truck. Just the light, flickering in the distance, brighter than it should have been. The figure on the side of the road didn't move, didn't even acknowledge it, and I began to feel a creeping sense of unease. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. My hands were sweaty on the wheel as I sped up. I could hear the distant hum of the engine, but it felt like the sound was coming from far away. I glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing. No headlights. No sign of anyone behind me. That's when I saw the lights again. This time, they were right in front of me, and they weren't headlights. They were streetlights. But I was in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing around, no town, no rest stops. The lights flickered and then went out. I didn't have time to process what I was seeing before a voice crackled through my CB radio. "Hey there, you all right?" I nearly jumped out of my seat. The voice was smooth, calm, and deep. Too calm for this hour of the night. I grabbed the mic, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could feel my pulse in my throat. The voice didn't hesitate. "Name's Officer Brody. Just checking in. You in that stretch between Abbott and the bridge?" I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. I wasn't even sure if I had passed the bridge, but the officer's question felt off. "Yeah, I'm on Route 64 near the bridge. Why?" "Don't stop," Officer Brody replied, the words clear but urgent. "Just keep driving, no matter what. You hear me? Keep going." Before I could respond, the radio went dead. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hand trembling as I reached for the mic again. "What the hell, Officer Brody? Hello?" Nothing. Just static. The hum of the truck engine had become deafening. I looked around again. No other cars, no lights, only the cold stretch of road ahead, and I felt the weight of the night pressing down on me like a heavy stone. I thought about stopping. I really did. But the officer's warning lingered in my mind. So I kept driving, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see lights, but there was nothing, no sign of any vehicles at all. Then, out of nowhere, the lights came back on. This time, they were closer, too close. Street lights appeared, illuminating the road ahead, but the weird thing was, they weren't connected to anything. No poles, no wires, just floating lights in midair, casting a pale, eerie glow. I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding to a halt. My hands gripped the wheel so tight I thought my knuckles would crack. My eyes darted around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These lights weren't real. They couldn't be. They moved slowly, floating down the road like they were searching for something or someone. I grabbed the CB again. "Officer Brody, are you there? What the hell is going on?" Nothing. No response. The lights continued to move, and as they got closer, I saw something else. Dark figures. Shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe just beyond the light. Figures that didn't belong. They weren't human, not by any stretch. They were more like shapes, elongated, distorted, something from the dark corners of the earth. I threw the truck in gear, desperate to get away from whatever the hell this was. The lights followed me, moving eerily in sync with the truck, always staying just ahead like they were herding me forward. I didn't dare look at the figures in the distance. I just focused on the road, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing holding me together. My thoughts were scrambled. There was no way I could be seeing this. No way. Just as suddenly as it had started, the lights vanished. The road was dark again, but the silence was even worse. It was as if the night had swallowed everything up, every sound, every trace of what I had just witnessed. I didn't stop again until I reached the next town. The rest area was packed with trucks, but I couldn't bring myself to talk to anyone. I sat in my cab, shaking, staring out at the empty road. The events of the night replayed in my mind, and one thing stood out above all else. The officer's warning. Don't stop. I never did find out what happened that night, or who or what was watching me on that stretch of highway. The road's quiet now, just like it always is. But I never drive through that part of Route 64 after dark anymore. And if you're out there listening, driving the same roads, you might want to avoid that stretch too. Because if you see lights floating ahead of you, you should remember what I was told. Just keep driving, no matter what.
Next story.
It was the middle of winter when I first encountered what I can only describe as a nightmare made real. I've been a trucker for nearly 20 years, and over the years I've seen my fair share of strange things. Abandoned cars on the side of the road, odd lights in the distance, the occasional creepy phone call from some truck stop on a desolate stretch of highway. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened that night. It all started around 2 a.m. as I was heading down Route 41 through a particularly isolated stretch of Kentucky. The sky was overcast and snow was coming down in sheets, the kind of snow that made it feel like you were driving through a white void. I was the only truck on the road for miles, with no other vehicles in sight. The silence out there was unnerving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But there's no turning back when you're on a long haul, so I pushed on, trying to ignore the dread creeping up my spine. About an hour into my drive, my CB radio crackled to life. I hadn't heard a word from anyone for the last few hours, so it startled me. "Breaker, breaker, you copy!" I grabbed the mic, my heart pounding slightly from the sudden interruption. "Yeah, I'm here. Who's this?" A deep, gravelly voice came through. "This is Officer Dillard. You on 41, about 20 miles south of Pine Bluff." I glanced at my GPS. "Yeah, that's right. Why?" "Just want to give you a heads up," the officer said. "There's been some strange activity around that area. Nothing you need to worry about, but keep your eyes peeled, all right?" Strange activity? My stomach twisted. What kind of strange activity? Don't know. Just keep your distance. Reports of some odd figures near the road. Just want to make sure you're aware. I didn't have time to respond before the radio went silent again. At first, I thought maybe the officer was just dealing with some prank, or maybe it was one of those highway rumors that truckers swap. Still, the hairs on my neck stood up, and I could feel the weight of the air inside the truck thickening. I shook my head, telling myself to stop being paranoid. But I couldn't. I had been on the road long enough to know when something felt wrong. About 10 minutes later, I saw the flashing lights up ahead, blue and red, cutting through the falling snow. My first thought was that it was another trucker pulled over by the police, but as I got closer, I realized it was a cop car parked at the edge of the road. It was strange because the officer wasn't in the car. There were no other vehicles around, no signs of any traffic stop. I slowed down, my headlights illuminating the empty road in front of me. As I neared the police car, I saw something even stranger, a figure standing beside it. It was a man, dressed in a long, dark coat and a hat pulled low over his face. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the headlights as I passed by. I kept my eyes on the road, but my gut twisted. There was something about the man that felt off. I looked into my rearview mirror, expecting to see the man disappear into the darkness, but he didn't. He was still there, standing still in the exact same position as if frozen in time. I shouldn't have done it, but I had to know more. I pulled over ahead of the cop car, my heart hammering in my chest. My instincts were telling me not to get involved, but curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed the CB radio again. "Hey, Officer Dillard, you still there?" The radio buzzed, and I waited, but there was no response. I called again. Nothing. Just silence. Something in my gut told me that wasn't right. I got out of my truck, the cold air slapping my face as I stepped into the snow. The cop car was only a few yards away now. The figure was still there, standing like some kind of shadow. As I approached, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Every instinct told me to turn around and get back in the truck, but I kept walking forward. When I got close enough to see the man's face, my breath caught in my throat. He had no face. I'm not talking about a mask or something covering his face. There was nothing there. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin where a face should have been, like a featureless doll. And his posture, it was stiff, unnatural, like he wasn't even human. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. I turned to run back to the truck, but when I looked up, I froze in terror. The officer, the one who had warned me over the radio, wasn't in his car anymore. He was standing in front of me, blocking my path. His uniform was exactly the same as the one I had seen earlier, but his eyes were cold, empty, and his expression was twisted into something almost grotesque. "Where do you think you're going, driver?" The officer's voice came out, but it wasn't the same voice I had heard on the radio. It was lower, deeper, and filled with an eerie resonance that made my blood run cold. I backed up, but I couldn't move fast enough. The officer's hand shot out, grabbing my arm with inhuman strength. His grip was like ice, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. "Stay," he said, in a voice that was both commanding and soothing, as though it was pulling me into some kind of trance. I pulled away, adrenaline surging. I broke free from his grasp, stumbling backward until I collided with my truck. I quickly jumped into the cab, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, starting the engine. Before I could even think, I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, tearing down the road. I didn't look back, not even once. I drove for what felt like hours, my heart still racing in my chest. I didn't stop again until I reached a rest area near a small town where I parked under the flickering lights. The entire time, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that officer or that faceless man following me. I tried to call the police the next morning to report the strange encounter, but when I gave them the location, they told me there were no officers out there that night. There was no record of any activity in that area. No missing persons. Nothing. I haven't been back to Kentucky since. I've heard similar stories from other truckers who've passed through Route 41, but no one can explain what happened. All I know is that sometimes when I'm driving at night and I hear that soft, eerie hum of the CB radio, I still expect to hear that voice again, the one that told me to stay.
Next story.
I've always been a skeptic. I've heard all the trucker stories, tales of hitchhikers that disappear, ghostly figures that wander the roads, and strange things that can't be explained, but I never believed any of it. The road is a lonely place, and sometimes the mind plays tricks on you. But the night I had that experience, it changed everything. It was a typical run, long haul from Atlanta to Dallas. I'd been driving for hours, my eyes half closed as I pushed on, knowing the road would be long and endless. It was around 1:30 a.m. when I crossed into a stretch of highway just north of Shreveport, Louisiana. The road was isolated, with only the occasional billboard or gas station dotting the horizon. This part of the country is known for its desolate stretches, but it wasn't the emptiness that unsettled me. It was the silence. Not the normal quiet of the night, but a dead, unnatural silence. I had just passed a small exit when I saw the figure on the side of the road. I was cruising at a steady 60 miles per hour, my headlights cutting through the dark when I noticed something move on the shoulder. At first, I thought it was just a stray animal or maybe a person who needed help. But as I drew closer, I could tell it was no ordinary sight. A man stood on the side of the road wearing a dark trench coat. His face turned away from the road. He wasn't moving, just standing there, frozen in place like a statue. I didn't know why, but my stomach tightened and a cold chill ran through me. It was way too late for anyone to be out here, especially standing still like that in the dark. I slowed down as I approached, trying to figure out what he was doing. Maybe he was waiting for a ride, or maybe he'd been stranded. I figured I could offer him some help, just to get him out of the cold. "Hey!" I called out through my rolled-down window as I neared. "You all right?" There was no response. He didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge me at all. He just stood there, completely motionless. I stopped the truck, unsure of what to do. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. I glanced in my side mirror, checking to see if there was anyone else around, but the road was empty. It was just me and the man on the side of the road. I decided to get out against my better judgment. Maybe he needed help, maybe he was in trouble, but as I stepped out of the truck, I felt it again, the chill in the air, colder than it should have been for a Louisiana night. I walked toward him slowly, and as I got closer, I realized something that made my heart stop. The man wasn't standing still because he was waiting for a ride. He wasn't standing still at all. He was stuck in place, like a mannequin, frozen in the position he had been in for who knows how long. The air around him seemed to pulse with something unnatural, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The closer I got, the more I saw. His coat fluttered gently in the wind, but his face was completely obscured by a hood that wasn't even attached to anything. It was as if it was part of the air itself, floating just above his head. There was no fabric, no seams, just the eerie outline of a face. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of whispering. It wasn't coming from the man. It was coming from the air around him. A low, almost inaudible murmur that made the blood freeze in my veins. It sounded like hundreds of voices speaking at once, but the words were indistinct, jumbled. The whispering grew louder, growing in intensity, filling my head with a pressure I couldn't escape. I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the ground, my body unwilling to act. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get back in the truck and drive away as fast as possible, but I couldn't. It was like the air around me was holding me captive. And then something shifted. The man's head moved, very slowly as if some invisible force were lifting it. But when his face came into view, I wish I hadn't seen it. His eyes weren't eyes at all. They were hollow, dark voids swirling with what looked like smoke, like something was trapped inside them. His skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too tight over his bones, and his mouth, when it opened, was not a human mouth. It was jagged, filled with sharp, uneven teeth that seemed to go on forever. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but the air was thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was trying to choke me. And then he spoke. "You should have kept driving." The voice was hollow, echoing in my head like it wasn't coming from his mouth at all. The words didn't just sound like they were being spoken. They felt like they were being forced into my mind, like I was hearing them from deep underwater. I staggered back, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. I turned to run, but my body refused to cooperate. It felt like the road itself was pulling me back, like gravity was working against me. But then, just as I was about to collapse, the man's figure flickered. One moment, he was standing there, his face still twisted and distorted, and the next moment, he was gone, vanished without a trace. The whispering stopped. The air cleared, and I was left standing there, gasping for breath, as though I'd just woken from a nightmare. I don't know how long I stood there, Time seemed to warp, like I had stepped into a place outside of reality. But when I finally snapped out of it, I was alone on the side of the road and everything was eerily quiet. I ran back to my truck, jumped inside, and slammed the door behind me. I didn't even bother starting the engine right away. I just sat there, heart racing, too scared to move. I eventually drove on, but I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I've never gone back to that stretch of highway, and I'll never forget the feeling of that man's presence. I've heard stories since then from other truckers who claim to have seen something similar. A figure standing on the side of the road, not moving, waiting for someone to stop. Some say it's a ghost. Some say it's something worse. But whatever it is, I learned the hard way that some things on the road aren't meant to be explained. And if you're ever out there, late at night, driving down a lonely stretch of highway, and you see someone standing in the dark, don't stop. Just keep driving, don't look back.
Next story.
It was a normal evening, at least I thought it would be. I was driving late, as usual, taking the long haul from Oklahoma City to Tulsa. It was the kind of quiet drive where the sound of the tires on the asphalt is the only noise you can hear, and the road ahead is just a black ribbon stretching on for miles under the faint glow of the moon. I've been a trucker for more years than I care to admit, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to experience. I had just passed a few small towns when the radio started acting up. It was static at first, then a faint voice like someone was talking through the airwaves, but the signal was too weak to understand. I fiddled with the dials trying to get a better signal, but no luck. That's when I noticed something else. Something that made my blood run cold. A police car. It wasn't the usual highway patrol, though. This was different. The lights on top were flashing, but it was almost like they were too bright. The car appeared in my rearview mirror, but there was no siren, no sound of tires on the road. It was just there, cruising along behind me, staying at a steady distance. I figured it was just another officer doing his rounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. I kept my eyes on the rear view, trying to make sense of it. The car didn't move forward or backward. It stayed in the same position behind me, like it was waiting. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:13 a.m. That's when I saw it again, the headlights. Only this time, they were coming from behind a darkened curve up ahead, and they seemed too bright, too close. I couldn't see the full shape of the vehicle, but I could tell it was a big one, just like the police car behind me. For some reason, I started to feel claustrophobic. The wide open road was suddenly closing in on me, and my pulse quickened. I turned the wheel, making a sharp right into a small rest stop area, hoping to shake the feeling, hoping I was just imagining things. But the police car followed. I stopped at the entrance of the rest stop, but the car didn't pull up behind me like I thought it would. Instead, it stayed in the distance, just a few hundred feet away, the lights flashing but silent. I sat in my rig, frozen, not sure what to do. I decided to get out and stretch my legs. Maybe the fresh air would clear my head. But as I opened the door and stepped down onto the gravel, I felt the chill of the night air bite at me, and I heard something strange. Whispers. Low, indistinct voices, like a crowd murmuring, but when I turned around, there was no one in sight. I shook it off, chalking it up to fatigue. Maybe I was just too tired to think clearly. I walked toward the building to use the restroom, hoping the quiet would calm my nerves. But as soon as I entered the restroom, I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the mirror above the sink, I could see the police car, reflected clearly as it parked just outside. I froze, staring at it. But there was something wrong with the reflection. The car wasn't right. The headlights weren't shining anymore, and there was no movement inside the vehicle. It looked like an empty shell, like the car had been abandoned. I spun around, rushing to the window to look outside, but when I peered through the glass, the car was gone. Vanished, just like that. There was no sign of it. I looked back to the mirror again, still empty. It was like I had imagined the whole thing. Confused and increasingly unnerved, I made my way back to my truck. My hands were shaking as I climbed back into the cab, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. A shadow. Not a figure, but a shape. something moving in the distance behind me. I didn't know if it was a person or something else entirely. I wanted to pull away, to drive off and get out of there, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. It was like something was holding me in place, pulling me deeper into the mystery of what was going on. I started the truck, slowly easing it back onto the road, my eyes darting between the mirrors, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the darkness stretching out in front of me and the eerie quiet that now felt more oppressive than peaceful. I drove for a few more miles, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine, when suddenly my headlights illuminated something up ahead. A figure, standing by the side of the road. I slowed down, my instincts screaming at me not to stop, but I couldn't help it. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, dressed in a dark uniform that looked too familiar. I could make out the shape of a badge on its chest. It was a police officer. I pulled over to the shoulder, unsure what to do. My mind raced, torn between the instinct to help and the fear that something wasn't right. I cracked my window, just a few inches. "Need help?" I called out. The officer didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me, his face hidden by the shadows of his hat. But there was something about the way he stood, rigid, unnaturally still, that sent a chill through me. I tried again. "Hey, you okay?" This time, he stepped forward, but instead of coming closer to my truck, he moved toward the woods just off the side of the road. I watched in confusion, not understanding what was happening. He was walking slowly, deliberately, and he never once turned around. Something felt very wrong. Before I could react, the officer vanished into the trees. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, but there was nothing. No movement, no trace of him anywhere. It was like he had never been there in the first place. I don't remember much after that. The rest of the drive was a blur, my eyes heavy, my thoughts scattered. I just wanted to get to my destination and forget what had happened. But there's something I can't shake. The voice I had heard earlier, those whispers, they started again, just faintly in the back of my mind. And every now and then, when I glance at my rearview mirror, I think I see the flashing lights of that police car, just behind me, waiting. I've been driving for years, and I've learned to trust my instincts. Something tells me that whatever I saw that night, whatever happened on that lonely stretch of highway, it wasn't the work of a normal cop. It wasn't human.
Next story.
It was late, way too late, and the highway stretched before me, endless and lonely. The only company I had was the occasional flicker of lights from passing cars and the hum of my rig as it powered through the miles. I was driving a big rig, heading west on Route 66, hauling a load from Denver to Phoenix. It wasn't my first trip, and I had done this route countless times before, but this night was different. I've heard all the stories from fellow truckers about strange things happening on the road. Some of them were just local legends, and some had a grain of truth, I figured. But until this night, I never truly believed in the weird and unexplainable. But after what happened, I don't think I'll ever be able to look at the highway the same way. It started at a truck stop somewhere near the Arizona border, a small, rundown place with old neon signs that barely lit up the parking lot. The air was thick with heat, even though it was well past midnight. I pulled in to refuel and grab a quick bite, hoping to catch a few minutes of sleep before hitting the road again. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. A man, standing by the pumps, staring at my truck. I didn't think much of it at first. A lot of folks out here work late shifts, and it's not uncommon for truckers to hang around and talk shop. But there was something unsettling about this guy. He was tall, gaunt, with a face that was pale and drawn. His clothes looked outdated, like something from the 70s or 80s, and his eyes, well, they didn't look right. They were wide, almost bulging, and his pupils were unnaturally large. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I had this overwhelming sense that something was wrong. Still, I shook it off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, right? I went inside the diner to grab some food. The place was mostly empty, save for a couple of truckers chatting in a booth in the back. The waitress, a tired-looking woman with dark circles under her eyes, came over to take my order. "You passing through?" she asked, a strange look in her eyes like she was sizing me up. "Yeah," I said, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut. "Just headed to Phoenix." She nodded, but then she paused, glancing out the window at the pumps. "That man out there," She began quietly, almost as if she was afraid to speak too loudly. You seen him before? I followed her gaze and saw the man I'd noticed earlier still standing by my truck, just staring. His gaze was fixed on me now, his eyes piercing through the glass. He wasn't moving, not even an inch. No, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. First time I've seen him. The waitress's face darkened. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. He's not right, you know? People around here talk about him, but nobody ever sees him leave. He just appears sometimes, and when he does, bad things happen. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, bad things? The waitress swallowed hard, then shook her head. I shouldn't be telling you this, but if you're smart, you'll get back on the road and not look back. Don't stop here, not for anything. I wanted to laugh it off, to tell her it was just a local legend, but the fear in her eyes made me hesitate. I felt the weight of her words settling on me, heavy and oppressive. I paid for my meal and stood up to leave, but as I walked toward the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The man outside hadn't moved, not even a muscle. It was like he was frozen in place, his eyes locked onto mine. I hurried to my truck, hoping to get out of there as quickly as possible. But just as I reached for the door handle, I heard a voice behind me. Where are you going, friend? It was the man. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't spoken in years. He was standing right behind me now, too close for comfort. I hadn't even heard him approach. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was something wrong about his presence. He was still staring at me, those bulging eyes wide and unblinking. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I just need to get going, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I've got a long drive ahead. The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was thin, twisted. You don't understand, he said slowly, like he was savoring each word. You'll never leave. Before I could react, the world seemed to tilt. The ground shifted beneath me and I felt dizzy. The sky above me had turned an unnatural shade of black, the stars barely visible. The air was thick, heavy with a tension I couldn't explain. I turned to the truck, desperate to get in, but the door wouldn't open. It was locked, but I hadn't locked it. I pulled again, harder this time, and finally, the door creaked open. I jumped into the cab and slammed it shut, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I turned the ignition, and for a second, nothing happened. The engine was silent. My stomach dropped. I tried again, and finally, the engine roared to life. But as I looked up, the man was standing outside my window, his face inches from the glass, grinning that awful grin. Get out, he rasped, his voice a hiss. I slammed the gas pedal down, and the truck lurched forward, my tires screeching against the pavement. I didn't look back, but I could feel his gaze burning into the back of my head, could almost hear his voice calling after me, whispering words I couldn't make out. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the night darker than I'd ever seen it. The stars were gone, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I drove for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. My heart was racing, my breath shallow. Eventually, I came upon another truck stop, but something told me to keep going, to not stop again. I didn't care if I ran out of gas. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. And when I finally did make it to Phoenix, I never spoke a word of it to anyone. The man, the truck stop, the eerie silence, it was all too much. But every time I drive down that stretch of Route 66 now, I keep my eyes on the road. I don't stop at any of the old rundown places. I don't care what time it is or how tired I am, because I know what's out there. And I don't want to meet him again.
Next story.
I've been driving for years, and you start to learn the ins and outs of the road. You get a feel for it. The way the highway shifts, how the air smells depending on where your little towns that seem to sleep under the stars. But every once in a while, something happens that just doesn't make sense. And this story, well, it's one of those things that still doesn't sit right with me. I was hauling a load through the back roads of Kentucky, a route I'd taken dozens of times before. It was about 3 a.m., that sweet spot in the night where the world feels like it's holding its breath. The only sounds were the rumble of my truck and the occasional whoosh of the wind. The moon hung high, barely visible through the thick clouds that had rolled in, and I could just barely make out the faded white lines of the road under my headlights. I wasn't in a hurry. No tight schedules or delivery deadlines. It was a calm, ordinary night, or at least it was supposed to be. About 30 miles from the nearest town, I noticed a car up ahead, parked on the side of the road. It seemed odd, especially this late at night. The headlights weren't on and the engine wasn't running, but someone was standing beside the vehicle. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat. I slowed down, thinking maybe he was having car trouble, but something didn't feel right. He wasn't moving. As I passed by, I glanced over, trying to see if he needed help. I couldn't make out his face, just his silhouette against the darkness, but there was something strange about him. He didn't look like someone who had broken down or needed assistance. There was no frantic waving, no obvious sign of distress, just standing there, completely still, as if waiting for something. I kept driving, but my curiosity gnawed at me. There was no reason for a person to be standing out there in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m. Something about it didn't sit well with me, so I decided to pull over a little farther down the road. Maybe he had broken down after all. I parked on the shoulder and got out, my boots crunching against the gravel. The air was colder now, sharper. I looked up at the dark sky, the weight of the fog pressing in on me. My heart rate picked up a little, though I wasn't sure why. I took a deep breath and started walking back toward the spot where I had seen the man standing. When I got closer, I could see that the car was an old sedan, rusted and worn, its tires half flat. But there was no sign of the man. I scanned the area, nothing. Just the car and the open stretch of road. My stomach churned. I took a few more steps forward, looking for any sign of him, but I couldn't see him anywhere. Then I heard something. A rustling sound from the trees nearby. It was faint, but unmistakable. I froze, turning my head toward the source of the noise. The trees were thick, but I could make out the silhouette of something moving just beyond the tree line. A figure. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, but something made me keep watching. The figure stepped out from behind the trees. A tall man, his clothes dark against the night, his face obscured by shadows. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice hoarse in the silence. He didn't answer. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or something more, but the air around me felt charged now, heavy, like I was being watched. I took another step back, then another. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes hidden in the darkness. I turned to leave, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle with unease. But then, just as I started to walk away, I heard it. A voice, soft but distinct, coming from behind me. "Help me." I spun around, my heart thundering in my chest. But the man was gone. There was nothing but the stillness of the trees and the cold wind rustling the leaves. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was some kind of trick. Maybe I was just tired, hallucinating. I didn't know, but I didn't stick around to find out. I hurried back to my truck, my breath coming in sharp bursts, and climbed back into the cab. My hands were trembling as I started the engine, the truck rumbling to life beneath me. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Nothing. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest gas station. My skin was still crawling, my mind racing with what had just happened. The whole thing felt unreal, but the fear in my gut was real enough. I stepped inside, hoping to shake off the feeling, maybe get some coffee to settle my nerves. The attendant, an older woman with kind eyes, looked up when I walked in. "You all right, hon?" she asked, noticing my pale face. I nodded, trying to brush it off. "Yeah, just a long drive. Saw something weird on the road earlier." She raised an eyebrow. "Weird like what?" I told her the whole story about the man by the car and the strange feeling in the air. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're lucky you didn't get any closer." I froze, not sure what she meant. "What do you mean?" She leaned in closer, her voice dropping low. "There are stories around here about that stretch of road. People say there's a spirit, a man who died years ago on the same road. He was a trucker, just like you. But one night he disappeared, vanished without a trace. They say he's still out there, waiting for others to pass by. And if you stop, if you get too close, he might just follow you." I felt a chill run through me. My hands gripped the counter as I tried to keep my composure. "So you think I saw a ghost?" The woman nodded. "That's what the locals say. If you see him, you get away, fast. Because if he calls out to you, you might not be able to leave." I didn't know what to say. All I knew was that my gut was telling me that this wasn't some local legend or story to scare tourists. It felt real. It felt like something had tried to reach out to me from beyond the living, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I left the station that night, my mind in a haze. I didn't go back on that road. Ever. And if you ask me about it now, I'll tell you the same thing I told myself that night. I don't know what I saw, but I don't plan on finding out again.
Next story.
The road was empty. The night, darker than it should have been, stretched out before me like a black abyss. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and my truck's engine was the only sound in the world. I had just left a small truck stop just outside of Amarillo, Texas, and was heading toward Albuquerque. I'd been on the road for hours, and despite the wariness creeping into my bones, I kept pushing forward. The miles stretched endlessly ahead of me. I've been on the road for most of my life. I've seen some strange things, but I've always chalked them up to fatigue or my imagination playing tricks on me. But that night, I encountered something that I can never explain. It started when I saw the figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just another hitchhiker, but something about it didn't sit right. I was just about to pass the spot when my eyes caught it. A tall, thin figure, standing alone in the dark, facing the road. There was something unnerving about the way it stood. No movement, just an eerie stillness that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake it off, but my curiosity got the best of me. I slowed the truck, pulling the shoulder of the road. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel as I came to a complete stop. The figure was standing about 30 feet away from my truck, too far for me to make out details, but close enough for my gut to tighten in warning. I rolled down the window, leaning my head out slightly. "Hey, you need a ride?" I shouted, but the figure didn't respond. I wasn't sure what to do. It wasn't like me to offer help to a stranger out in the middle of nowhere, but something about this felt different. I told myself it was just my imagination, tired from too many miles, too much coffee, but my instincts were screaming at me to leave. I started to roll up the window, but before I could, the figure moved. It didn't walk toward me. It didn't step forward like a normal person would. No, this thing slid across the ground. One moment it was standing still, and the next it was right at the edge of my truck, its face inches from mine. The air went still and my heart stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My eyes locked onto its face. Its skin was pale, too pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were wide open, unnaturally large, completely black, like there was no depth to them at all. I froze. My mind screamed at me to drive, to get away, but I couldn't move. The thing didn't speak, didn't make a sound. It just stared at me, its gaze penetrating deep into my soul, like it could see things about me I didn't even know about myself. Then, without a word, it opened its mouth. It wasn't a human mouth. It was too wide, too elongated. The shape of it was unnatural, stretching too far down its face. The moment it opened, I felt the temperature drop around me, like the air itself had become cold, heavy, suffocating. My instincts finally kicked in. I slammed the truck into gear and floored the gas pedal. The truck shot forward, the tires spinning against the gravel, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it, something following me, something close, just out of reach, but ever present. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel. The road ahead was still dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the light of my headlights. The reflection of my side mirrors seemed off, like there was something there in the distance, something shifting in the shadows. My heart raced as I fought the urge to look again. I kept my eyes on the road, driving faster, praying I could outrun whatever had been standing next to my truck. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was right behind me, following me. Then, out of nowhere, the truck's radio crackled to life. I hadn't touched it in hours, but the static filled the air, growing louder and louder until I could hear the faintest whisper. It was a voice, but not like any voice I'd ever heard before. It was deep, guttural, like it came from somewhere far beneath the earth, something ancient and unknowable. "Turn back," the voice hissed. "Turn back before it's too late." I slammed my hand onto the radio dial, desperately trying to turn it off, but the static only grew louder, the whispers more insistent. My head pounded, and I could feel the pressure building in my chest, like the very air in the truck was being sucked away. I could hardly breathe. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled the truck to the side of the road, my hands trembling as I cut the engine. The night around me was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, suffocating you. I sat there for a moment, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was alone. There was nothing around me, no sign of the figure, no movement, just the quiet, the oppressive stillness of the dark road stretching out before me. I tried to steady my breathing, but I couldn't. I felt like I was being watched, like there was something out there, just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting. And then, in the rearview mirror, I saw it again. The figure. It was standing at the edge of the road, just behind the truck. Its black eyes reflected back at me, glowing in the darkness, and I knew with a sickening certainty that it had been waiting for me. It hadn't followed me. It had been here the entire time. I couldn't take it anymore. I started the truck again and drove as fast as I could, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, never looking back. The radio crackled again, but I didn't listen. I didn't care. I just needed to get away, to put miles between me and whatever that thing was. When I finally reached Albuquerque, I pulled into a rest stop, parked my rig, and didn't get out. I locked the doors, rolled up the windows, and stayed there, waiting for the morning. The night felt endless, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me from the shadows. I haven't driven that route since, and every time I pass that stretch of highway, I get a chill in my spine and a sick feeling in my stomach. I'll never know what that thing was or why it followed me that night. But I know one thing, it wasn't human.
Next story.
I've been on the road for as long as I can remember. Long-haul trucking is my life. Most nights, the road feels like home. The rhythmic hum of the engine, the radio playing old tunes, the flashing lights of other trucks in the distance. It's peaceful in its own way. But not that night. I was heading through the backwoods of Tennessee, a desolate stretch of road that seemed to go on forever. It was one of those nights when the fog rolls in thick, heavy, and damp. My headlights barely cut through the white blanket hanging over the road. It was a quiet night, almost too quiet, with no other trucks in sight for miles. I was nearing the middle of nowhere when I saw the first sign, a small blue light in the distance, barely visible through the mist. I slowed down, thinking it was just another trucker parked on the side. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a truck at all. It was a police car. There it was, sitting there by the side of the road, parked with its headlights off. At first, I thought nothing of it. Cops pull over trucks all the time. I was about to pass by when I saw something that made my stomach twist. The officer was standing outside, his back to the car, staring straight into the fog, unmoving. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. My first instinct was to drive past, keep my distance, but something about the scene unsettled me. I didn't know if it was the odd stillness or the way he stood there, but I pulled over anyway. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but in this line of work, you never ignore your instincts. I rolled down my window, the cool night air rushing in. The officer didn't turn around. "Hey, you okay?" I called out, my voice cutting through the silence. Nothing. I called out again, louder this time, but he didn't move an inch. A chill ran through me, and for a second I considered driving off. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe he was hurt or in trouble. I opened the door and stepped out, walking slowly toward the officer. As I got closer, I noticed his uniform was strange, old, worn, and faded. The buttons were tarnished like they hadn't been touched in years. But that wasn't the worst part. What really made my blood run cold was his face. It was pale, almost lifeless, and his eyes, well, they weren't eyes at all. They were just empty, black holes, like there was nothing behind them. I froze. A deep, primal fear gripped me. Something in my gut screamed to run, but I couldn't move. The officer's head slowly turned toward me, his body still rigid and unmoving. He stared at me for what, like eternity. And then, "Get out of here." His voice was raspy, like a whisper from the grave. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to ask if he needed help, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. It was like his words paralyzed me. Without saying anything else, the officer slowly turned back toward the fog, as if he hadn't even spoken to me at all. His feet didn't seem to touch the ground as he began to walk away, disappearing into the mist. I didn't wait around to see where he went. I bolted back to the truck, got in, and slammed the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the truck lurching forward before I even had a chance to think. I glanced in my rearview mirror but saw nothing. No sign of the officer, no flash of his blue lights, just the empty road stretching out behind me. I didn't stop driving that night. I kept going for hours, my mind racing with what I had just seen. I couldn't make sense of it. I had heard the stories, people talking about strange encounters with officers or mysterious figures on the road. I'd even brushed it off myself, thinking it was just road legends, things people made up to scare newcomers. But this was different. This felt real, and it felt wrong. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but the fear lingered. When I finally pulled into a truck stop, I was so shaken that I could barely even function. I parked the rig, grabbed my things, and headed inside to get something to eat. The woman behind the counter gave me a strange look when I walked in, and after a minute of silence, she spoke. "You seen the officer tonight?" she asked, her voice low. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "The officer out by Route 11, she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "You didn't talk to him, did you?" I nodded slowly, my mouth dry. "I did. He was on the side of the road, just standing there. He didn't look right." The woman lowered her voice even more. "You're lucky you didn't end up like the others. Folks around here say he's not a real cop. He's one of them, the ones who never left. That they died in a crash years ago, but they still walk that stretch of road. They don't talk to just anyone. They choose who they speak to." I stared at her, my mind reeling. "You're saying he's dead?" She nodded. "They don't really explain it. It's just a local legend, but everyone around here knows not to mess with the ghosts. You drive through at night, and you might just end up seeing one of them. They're the ones that keep people from leaving, keep them on the road. If he talked to you, well, you better stay off that stretch of highway." I didn't say anything more. I was too numb, too confused to process what she'd just told me. But I knew one thing for sure, I was never going near that stretch of road again. A few days later, I did a little research. The officer I had seen was from a department that had been shut down years ago after a terrible crash involving 2 police vehicles. The story was always the same. A terrible, fatal accident. And some say the officers never really left the road. Their spirits, trapped in that endless loop, were still there, waiting for someone to wander into their path. I still drive, but not through that part of Tennessee. I can't explain what happened to me that night. Whether it was a ghost, a hallucination, or something else, but I don't mess with things that aren't supposed to be there.